The prophecy of Isaiah. We've now reached presentation 19. And Isaiah tells the story of what happened, which illustrates and shows the relevance of his message throughout the book. Remember, Judah, the nation, the people of God, were being surrounded with attacks from empires and nations all around. And Isaiah has presented overall three very strong messages. Trust God for the answers. You don't have them. Your resources, your weapons don't have the answers. Trust God. You're not powerful enough to resist these forces. But put your house in order. Things had gone badly wrong amongst the people of God. Their spiritual and social structures were in a dreadful state. Get God back to the center of daily life. And leave those who are trying to attack you, leave them to God. He'll deal with this. And it lays down a very important principle, that when the people of God are persistently attacked and harried by other people, then the attackers inevitably in due time will face the consequences for their actions. Now there's a direct relevance for us today. The people of God in the West were slowly being marginalized and put down, misrepresented and attacked. The people of God in communist states are being imprisoned and tortured at a great rate. People in the Islamic world, the people of God, the followers of Jesus, are being treated atrociously. It's going on all over the world, ignored by our media largely, but it's happening. And the same things apply today. We don't have the answers. We're not clever enough. God's got the answers. But we've got to put our house in order, particularly in the West. The reputation of the people of God in our churches and Christian groups is simply not good. And with justification, there are things that need to be put right. But that truth still stands. Those who persist in harrying and attacking the followers of Jesus inevitably will face consequences for their actions. And that's a message that those who are doing this today will have to face sooner or later. And there are the beginning signs of it in the Middle East. But the people of God are still suffering in a dreadful way. But the seeds of social destruction, they're already laid within these nations. They created them themselves. Isaiah pictures two choices. We can either go that way, run our own show, or get God back into the frame of practical daily living. And he pictures it this way. Run our own show, we tend to make a mess of it. Get God back into the control in the center. He knows what's best. He pictures it that way. The desert turning to become productive land. Isaiah's a great one for his contrasts. When we run our own show, we tend to mess up. And when we get God back into the frame, things tend to go well. With all our cleverness, we've got a sense of arrogance and selfishness, and we mess things up throughout the world. At the level of families, relationships, workplace, communities, nations, internationally. Get God back into the center. He made us. He knows what's best. He can direct us. He can release the fruitfulness of living for us. But the choice is ours, and Isaiah paints that contrast and makes it clear to the leadership of Judah of his day. The choice is yours. Which way are you going to go? And that is always true. And it's worth pondering that frame. When we squeeze God to the margins of life, in due time we end up messing up our world. Because you see, if God's squeezed to the margins, we become center stage. And we seek our agendas. Our agendas conflict with the agendas of other humans. We end up with conflict, mess, disaster, hurt. get God back to the center, then we're all following the same agenda. He can release the transformation. He knows what's best. There's a very deep principle there. And we in the communities, the Christian communities of the West, particularly in the West, we've squeezed God to the margins. We've locked him up in our church buildings and our ritual. We're messing things up. Turn away from that, says Isaiah. Get God back to the center. Listen to him. He alone can release the transformation. And that transformation will spill out to bless the world around. Now let's move on. Isaiah shows how it worked out in the reign of King Hezekiah. But it's quite a complicated story. Let's go back to the three great messages Isaiah has been stressing throughout. In chapters 36 and 37, Isaiah is faced with the onslaught of Assyria. The army of Sennacherib has moved south, defeated the Egyptian army, sacking the fortresses and towns and communities of Judah, absolutely brutalizing the people who are captured, because they were a brutal people, the Assyrians. And now they're setting up for the siege of Jerusalem. And Isaiah is in desperation. Then there's another story in chapter 38. Isaiah faces an illness. Hezekiah faces an illness which Isaiah shows is terminal. From time to time, this comes to people. Hezekiah, in anguish, hopelessness, a young man, turns to God. And he does recover. We'll see how in a moment. In chapter 39, there's the story of a delegation that comes from Babylon. Hezekiah tried to form an alliance with Babylon against Assyria. The delegation comes to kind of congratulate the king for a recovery from his illness. But instead of putting God back into the center, Hezekiah parades his own glory, his wealth, his richness, the temple, his armaments, his fortresses, the plans he's made to defend his nation. We're a reliable partner against Assyria, is what he's saying. He makes a dreadful mistake. Now the difficulty is that these three things are put in Isaiah's story and in the parallel accounts and other documents. They're not in the right order. But Isaiah's put them in an order for a very good reason. His order is theological, not chronological. He has not put them in the time order because he wants chapter 39 to be where it is, because it leads into the need for chapter 40 onwards. Isaiah had failed, despite all the good things he did. And Isaiah moves into chapter 40 to show that the people of God needed better leadership than even good Hezekiah could offer. So it's a logical order, but it's not chronological. Now remember, time's counted backwards. That came first. Now I've put in likely dates. Remember, in those days they didn't have calendars and years and records. And of course, how could they count backwards? Because it was hundreds of years before Jesus' coming. But that seems a possible date. It fits all the evidence. Shortly after that, the delegation arrives to congratulate his recovery. But it's after that that the land is sacked. So the order of the chapters isn't the order of history, for a very good reason. But when you first read it, it's slightly confusing. Here's a possible picture of dates. Now that's a normal pattern. Kings work together, father with a son. So Hezekiah was in a kind of co-regency with his father Ahaz, who was not a good king. On the death of Ahaz, Hezekiah takes over. His illness about there. The Babylonian delegation comes in just after. Sennacherib moves south. He's already clipped the wings of the Babylon people. He now defeats the Egyptian army. Hezekiah has nobody to turn to. Most of Judah has been wiped out. And now he's setting up a siege around Jerusalem. His lifespan is that. Sennacherib, his rule, we don't know when he was born, but his rule was that period. And it ends up in tragic assassination at the hands of one of his sons. So there's the date sequence which helps us to understand the events. The illness, the delegation, and then Sennacherib comes to batter the land into submission. Now let's look at some of the events. Now the sources of information we've got are from chapters 36 to 39, the stretch we're looking at in this and the two following presentations. We've got a fuller record in 2 Kings. And there's a lot of overlap, exact quotation one to the other. It's consistent. There's a shorter summary in 2 Chronicles. But the Assyrians kept accurate records, which we've got. All of them fit together pretty well. So we've got very strong evidence of the events that actually took place. But we have to remember the Assyrians never record anything that goes against them. They selected the events. Now in 705 Sennacherib assumes power, and he's got little bits of revolts round the edges of his empire, and he starts to flatten things off a little bit and control things. He's done most of that when he starts then to look at how is he going to defeat Egypt and Judah, that alliance. He's clipped the wings of Babylon, but he has to travel south to deal with the people of Judah and the Egyptian army. He first of all destroys the Egyptian army. They turn tail and flee. He then turns on the land of Judah. And in particular, he captures the very strong fortress of Lachish, which was a kind of defence of Jerusalem. And the siege, the preparations are underway for that. And at that point he sends envoys to negotiate with the city leaders. He wants them to capitulate. But if you capitulate with the Assyrians, they did dreadful things. Public torture of all the males, and execution would be the norm. The women would be raped. Not a good prospect. The delegation meets the delegation from the city leadership, and they just mock Hezekiah. And they ridicule the God of Hezekiah, Yahweh. Hezekiah gets the news of what's been said. He goes and seeks advice from Isaiah, but before he gets the advice, he goes off to the temple and asks God for help. Wise move. Isaiah gets the message and sends a message back to King Hezekiah, telling him that Sennacherib wouldn't take the city. Not to worry. Then events move on. Having not capitulated, Sennacherib now sends another delegation, but this time it's a written set of demands. He's putting the pressure on King Hezekiah. Hezekiah takes that written set of demands. He takes it into the temple, as it were, lays the letter out before God and prays. A wise move. Then Isaiah sends a long message to Hezekiah, confirming a lot of the details of what he said before, including that Sennacherib will be defeated, will go back to his own country with the remnants of an army that would be decimated, and he would be assassinated. And in fact, disease attacks Sennacherib's forces and they retire to Assyria. If you look at the Assyrian records, the things are all there. But they don't explain why they gave up the siege of Jerusalem. But they do record that they did give it up and they went back. And they never troubled Judah again in Sennacherib's lifetime. Exactly as Isaiah had said would happen. Now let's look at the other events. Now they took place earlier, remember, but they're recorded by Isaiah later because he wants these events to lead into the latter part of the book. This is Hezekiah's illness. He was a young man. He sends for Isaiah. Now, Hezekiah was unlike his father. Ahaz just didn't listen to Isaiah. Hezekiah did. Overall, he was a good king. And Isaiah reveals that the illness is terminal. Not good news for a young man with no heir to turn to on the throne. He prays his heart out. And even before Isaiah has left the palace precinct, we get that from the king's record, God speaks to Isaiah and sends Isaiah back. God shows Isaiah that God has heard the prayer of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah will recover and will have 15 more years to reign. That's very unusual to things to be as precise as that, but it turned out to be true. And a sign is given that this will happen. Now, a bit after that, the leader of Babylon, who was called Merodach-Baladan, remember the Babylonians had formed some kind of alliance with the people of Judah against Assyria. Now, Merodach-Baladan had had his power greatly restricted, so he was hoping that Judah would help out. He hears of Hezekiah's recovery, and he sends a delegation. But instead of showing that God had spared his health and given him more years to reign, Hezekiah proudly shows off the wealth, the fortifications, the weapon store in Jerusalem. This is what I'm depending on, he says. I'm a reliable ally. Undermining all that God has shown him. When Isaiah hears of this, he challenges the king. And then Isaiah says, you've shown the Babylonians all your resources, your strengths, your weaknesses. They're going to use that against you eventually. They will take the lot. All the wealth in your temple and palace they will take. They'll take it away. They will destroy the kingly line, your successors. They will take the leaders of the nation into captivity in Babylon. They've now got inside knowledge. Isaiah had warned, do not form alliances with Babylon and Egypt. Hezekiah had not listened, or really he had inherited his father's lack of listening, and now they were facing a dreadful future. And in due time it all happened. And we can see the last events during the time of Jeremiah, the successor prophet. And the Babylonian army came in. They burnt the city to the ground, taking every single thing of value out of it. They destroyed the kingly line of Judah. And they took the leadership of the nation into captivity, just as Isaiah had prophesied, because God had revealed it to him. Let's go back to our picture of the three great messages Isaiah's made. Isaiah failed at that one. He only partly trusted God for the answers. When the chips were down and Sennacherib was knocking at the door of Jerusalem, he went into the temple, because Babylon had lost its power and the Egyptian army had been defeated. But there was a battle within Hezekiah. But when the disaster happened, Hezekiah did turn to trust God. So it's a mixed story. And Hezekiah was a good king. He made serious attempts to reform the nation of Israel, to get God back into the centre of the life of the nation. But history shows it was skin deep. And it was all reversed and made much worse by Hezekiah's son. Perhaps Hezekiah was a kind of lone voice, and the religious establishment went along with him for a while. But it was reversed when Hezekiah was replaced by his son. Now let's look at the text. It's in the background. This is the first confrontation. Sennacherib has travelled south. This is what it says. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. Then the king of Assyria sent his field commander with a large army from Lachish, the fortress town, to Hezekiah at Jerusalem. When the commander stopped at the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the launderer's field, Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, the palace administrator, Shebna the secretary, and Joah, son of Asaph, the recorder, went out to him. The delegations met. Now the Egyptian army had been routed. The land of Judah was sacked. Babylon had sunk in its power base. There was nobody to help Hezekiah, not at the human level. It's interesting to notice that the place they met was the same place where Isaiah had met Hezekiah's father, King Ahaz, and challenged him about negotiating with empires, in this case the empire of Assyria. King Ahaz didn't listen. And in a sense, here was the comeuppance, the logical outcome of a wrong policy. And it happened at the same place. Going on, the field commander said to them, "Tell Hezekiah," notice how he insults the king without putting on the title king. "This is what the great king, the king of Assyria, says." They're making a point. "On what are you basing this confidence of yours? You say you have counsel and might for war, but you speak only empty words. On whom are you depending that you rebel against me? Look, I know you're depending on Egypt, that splintered reed of a staff which pierces the hand of anyone leans on it." Remember, Egypt had been defeated. "Such is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who depend on him. But if you say to me, we're depending on the Lord our God, isn't he the one whose high places and altars Hezekiah removed, saying to Judah and Jerusalem, you must worship before this altar?" Misrepresenting the facts. The attackers of the people of God are good at that. Hezekiah had destroyed the false places of worship that had grown up throughout the land. They were not places where God was worshipped. "Come now, make a bargain with my master." You don't make bargains with Assyria. "With my master, the king of Assyria. I'll give you 2,000 horses, if you can put riders on them. How then can you repulse one officer of the least of my master's officials, even though you are depending on Egypt for chariots and horsemen? Furthermore, have I come to attack and destroy the land without the Lord? The Lord himself told me to march against this country and destroy it." Assyria, their technology and weaponry was much better. They'd moved into horses and chariots. Judah didn't have them. And even though they'd been provided with them, they didn't have men trained to use them. And then the insult. We're doing what God wants, says the king of Assyria. No, they weren't. And this is the way the people who attack the people of God go. Misrepresentation, distortion of truth, innuendo, attack. Overall, it's this. Your weapons can't help you. Egypt can't help you. Your God can't help you. I'm in the right. And I've got the power to force you to do what I want. Might is right. That was the great rule of Assyria. Brilliant army, brilliant armaments, technologically ahead of the nations and empires around. That's why they were so successful. Brutal beyond belief, wanton, vicious cruelty and torture of their enemies was just a way of life, just for the fun of it, to watch people screaming in agony. I've got the power to force you to do what I want. And Hezekiah knew what would be done to him if he'd have let himself get into the hands of the Assyrian army. Then the commander stood and called out in Hebrew. That was to make sure that all the listening people could understand it. Hear the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. This is what the king says. Don't let Hezekiah deceive you. Do not let Hezekiah persuade you to trust in the Lord when he says the Lord will surely deliver us. The city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah. This is what the king of Assyria says. Make peace with me and come out to me. Then each of you will eat fruit from their own vine and fig tree and drink water from their own cistern until I come and take you to a land like your own, a land of corn and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards. A barbed promise. Yes, allowed to have a little bit of food, enjoyment here. Then you'll go into captivity as my slaves. Do not let Hezekiah mislead you when he says the Lord will deliver us. Have the gods of any nations ever delivered their lands from the hand of the king of Syria? Who of all the gods of those nations have been able to save their lands from me? How then can the Lord deliver Jerusalem from my hand? But the people remained silent and said nothing in reply, because the king had commanded, do not answer him. Wise words. They were undermining the authority of the leader of the people, King Hezekiah. But even more seriously, they were mocking the God of Hezekiah and the God of the people of Judah, Yahweh. Sennacherib was placing himself above the God of the universe. How many leaders in the nations in the history of mankind have done that and are still doing it today? And God from his throne almost laughs. Puny human beings vaunting themselves up and thinking they are above the God of the universe. They've just written God out. We're in control. We take the decisions. Might is right. So, they're trying to undermine Hezekiah's leadership. Not a good picture. When Hezekiah heard all this, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and went to the temple of the Lord. He sent Eliakim, Shebna, and the leading priests, all wearing sackcloth, to the prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz. They told him, this is what Hezekiah says. This day is a day of distress and rebuke and disgrace. It's when children come to the moment of birth and there's no strength to deliver them. It may be that the Lord your God will hear the words of the field commander, whom his master the king of Assyria has sent to ridicule the living God, and that he will rebuke him for the words the Lord your God has heard. Therefore pray for the remnant that still survives. In desperation, they seek help from Isaiah. When King Hezekiah's officials came to Isaiah, Isaiah said to them, tell your master, this is what the Lord says. Do not be afraid of what you heard. These words with which the underlings of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Listen. When he hears a certain report, I will make him want to return to his own country, and there I will have him cut down with the sword. It sometimes takes everything to fall apart in life, for the penny to drop, and for us to turn to God for help. The message back from Isaiah was, God has heard, trust him. He alone can deliver the city. Nothing else will work. Trust God. That's the story. And the city was spared. There are deep messages for us today. in the West, that's what we've done. Now that may sound harsh, but look at it honestly, it's true. The facts show it. If you gather the numbers, the statistics over the last 100 years in the West, by any measure, the numbers of those who have a commitment to following Jesus is declining rapidly. Now there are groups that are expanding, but the decline in the big churches of the past is so great that it dwarfs the growth that's happening in smaller, newer groups. That is true. It's subtle, it's deep. There was a Christian influence that pervaded the whole of the structures of society. It's declining rapidly. And in practice, that's what's happening. And you can see it very, very clearly watching television today. And our society has gone along with us when we've locked God up in our buildings and rituals. And He's not out in the marketplace, in the real things of life, in our homes, our families, and our communities. And we have to admit that there are things that are seriously wrong in our Christian groups, and that our leadership have not faced up to with honesty at times. Now the extreme examples with the abuse of children, okay, only a minority have been involved, but all of us are tarred with the same brush. We have not dealt with that properly in the past, and we're reaping a whirlwind of criticism today. And this is what our societies in the West are telling us. Ponder that. It's true, isn't it? They don't take God seriously. If we want to go and practice our religion in our buildings and go through our rituals dressed up in our fancy clothes, well, it's up to us. But God's no relevance. And that is true. They know it. The forces around us know it's true. And they laugh at what we're doing. And when we try to stand against laws that are being passed that are simply wrong, they just say, we're wrong. We know better. And underneath it is that. And there's a driving force. It runs in many parts of the world, but it's strong in the West. Now there are people who are forcing us to do what society demands, or they're trying to. We're up against it. It's not that different to the days of Isaiah. There's Isaiah's messages. That's the message to you and me. Stop privatizing religion. Stop putting religion and locking it up in our churches and rituals. Perhaps we should throw away our buildings and our rituals and start again and live for Jesus in the way the New Testament pictures. Because when we live that way, He can transform our lifestyles so that we can make an impact. But there's no point in retaliating. We'll never win. The forces against us are far, far, far too strong, just as they were in the days of Hezekiah. There's a message for us today. That's the prophecy of Isaiah.